He walked into court a broken veteran, trembling hands, and a claim everyone had already decided to dismiss. The judge smirked. The gallery scoffed. His sister wept in silence, powerless to make them see the war still raging inside him. But then, the doors opened and a decorated four-star general walked in. What followed silenced the courtroom, cornered the judge, and turned a sterile hearing into a moment of truth, honor, and sacrifice. You won't believe how one soldier's story forced justice to finally listen. The county courthouse had all the warmth of a morgue. Whitewashed walls, chipped linoleum tiles, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with the faint irregularity of dying insects. Each hum felt like a hammer in Daniel Reyes' skull. The room smelled, faintly, of coffee gone stale, of paper, of something clinical and impersonal. He sat at the plaintiff's table, spine stiff but hands betraying him. His fingers trembled, not from cold, not from fear of truth, but from the weight of being forced to prove it. Daniel wore his only suit, the one his sister had helped him pick up from a discount rack 2 towns over. It didn't quite fit sleeves, a fraction too long, shoulders that pinched when he sat upright, but it was clean. His shoes, though scuffed, had been polished until he could see the faint blur of his reflection. He had tried, at least, to appear as the world wanted him to. Appear, composed, respectable, credible. Yet as he stared at the stack of papers in front of him, medical reports, discharge summaries, appeals denied, his chest tightened with the crushing irony of it. He had bled for his country, carried bodies under fire, saved lives with nothing but gauze and grit, and here he was, reduced to paperwork and trembling hands. Across the room, Judge Morton leaned back in his leather chair, a man who looked as if he had never been tested by anything heavier than a late brief. His robe draped over him like a costume. He'd long since grown tired of wearing the fabric gathering in lazy folds around his midsection. His lips curled into something halfway between a smirk and a sneer as he tapped his pen against the bench, each click echoing like a gavel strike. He hadn't said much yet, but his eyes had. They said this was a waste of time. The gallery was half filled, a few reporters with notebooks resting against their knees, curious locals who had wandered in after seeing the notice posted on the courthouse door, and 2 older men with veterans' caps sitting stiffly near the back, their faces unreadable. To them, this wasn't just a case. It was familiar. They had walked this same weary path of skepticism and bureaucracy. They had learned the hard way that the battlefield didn't end when you came home. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He glanced at the pitcher of water on the table, but the idea of pouring a glass, of lifting it without spilling, filled him with dread. His body betrayed him more in silence than in noise. His right leg bounced under the table, a habit he couldn't stop. His knuckles whitened as he clutched a pen too tightly. He was a soldier who had steadied his hands to stitch wounds under fire. Yet here they shook before the indifference of a court clerk. At the defense table sat a state attorney, hair perfectly combed, suit pressed to military perfection, though the man had never known the weight of body armor. He leafed casually through his file, clearly confident in the outcome. The Department of Veterans Affairs had won cases like this countless times before. They had policies, precedents, loopholes. They had patience. Men like Daniel didn't. The bailiff called the room to order with a voice that carried authority. Daniel recognized the clipped cadence of someone used to being obeyed. Everyone rose, chairs scraping the floor in an awkward chorus. Judge Morton entered fully now, robes swaying, and settled into his throne-like chair. He surveyed the room as though he were the sole arbiter of truth, the kind of man who measured worth not in sacrifice but in statistics. Daniel stood because he had to, but he felt the air close in around him. He thought of nights in Fallujah, where sand choked his lungs and mortar screamed across the horizon. He thought of men he'd carried, their blood soaking into his fatigues until it felt like his own. Those memories arrived uninvited, like shadows stretching long across a room that should have been bright. He blinked, tried to force them down, to focus on the here and now, but the buzzing lights, the sterile air, the heavy eyes on him, all of it, blurred into one truth. He was back on trial, not for crimes committed, but for pain carried. When he sat again, the tremor in his hands returned. He pressed his palms, flat against the table, as if he could steady himself by pinning his body to the wood. Across the bench, Judge Morton noticed and allowed himself a slight, almost imperceptible chuckle, not loud enough to draw rebuke, but sharp enough for Daniel to hear. It was the kind of laugh that said more than words ever could. You don't belong here, you're weak. This case is over before it begins. Daniel looked down at his notes. The Carefully written reminders scrawled in Claire's neat handwriting. Breathe, tell the truth. You've already survived worse. He exhaled, slow and shaky. But the sound of the judge's laugh lingered like shrapnel lodged too deep to remove. The hearing had barely begun, yet already the battlefield felt stacked against him. And in that sterile county courtroom, with fluorescent lights buzzing like distant artillery, Daniel Reyes braced himself for another fight he never should have had to wage. Daniel Reyes had the look of a man built for endurance, not spectacle. His frame was lean, his skin tanned from too many Georgia afternoons spent fixing his sister's fence or hauling lumber for odd jobs that barely paid the bills. His hair was clipped short, still carrying the ghost of military regulation. The streaks of gray betrayed years that had aged him faster than the calendar. At 32, he had the eyes of someone twice his age, tired, cautious, always scanning the room before he let himself sit, before the uniform, before the medals. He had been just another boy from a working-class family in rural Alabama. Oldest of three, Daniel had grown up with the burden of responsibility pressed into him early. His father left when he was 12, and his mother, sweet but fragile, leaned on him more than she should have. He learned to be steady for everyone else, even when the ground beneath him shook. That steadiness made him a good medic, though at the time he hadn't joined for that reason. He enlisted at 19, chasing structure, chasing a paycheck, chasing the idea that service might mean something more than survival. The army gave him exactly that structure. Yes, but also chaos. They trained him to heal men on the edge of death, to run toward the sound of gunfire with nothing more than a field kit strapped to his back. He wore the red cross on his arm like a promise, a symbol that no matter how bad it got, someone would be there to pull you back. In Fallujah, that promise nearly killed him. It had been 2008. His platoon was caught in an ambush, an explosion flipping a Humvee into a ditch. The world erupted into fire and dust, bullets cracking through the smoke. Daniel didn't think, he didn't pause. He ran. He dragged men twice his size, blood slick across his hands, lungs burning with smoke. He remembered the screams, the chaos, the sharp taste of iron in the back of his throat. By the time it was over, 12 men had survived who otherwise wouldn't have. Daniel had carried some, patched others, whispered lies of reassurance that they would live even when he wasn't sure himself. For that day, they pinned a bronze star on his chest, a ribbon, shiny and official, handed over with a handshake from a commander who barely knew his name. Daniel didn't wear it now. He didn't even take it out of the drawer where it lay, forgotten under old letters. Because medals didn't keep nightmares away. Medals didn't stop him from waking in the middle of the night, sweat soaking his shirt, heart pounding as if he were back in that ditch. Back under fire, back holding a boy whose last words had been, "Tell my mum I'm sorry." When he came home, the war didn't let him go. Crowded rooms made him flinch. Fireworks made him crawl out of bed and press himself against the wall until the echoes died. He couldn't sit with his back to a door, couldn't stomach the sharp pop of tires over potholes without jerking as if the earth itself had detonated. He wanted to explain, but how do you explain a war that followed you into every quiet moment? How do you make people understand that your silence wasn't indifference? It was survival. Asterisk, the Department of Veterans Affairs didn't understand. To them, he was just another file, another number. They asked him to fill out forms, to describe his nightmares in neat little boxes, to sit across from doctors who glanced at their watches as he tried to find words for things words weren't made to hold. Twice they denied him. Insufficient. Evidence. Condition. Not so disconnected. A third time, they wrote that his symptoms did not impair his ability to function in society. Daniel laughed bitterly when he read that. Function. Was it functioning to avoid grocery stores because the crowds made his chest tighten? Was it functioning to sleep in shifts, 2 hours here, an hour there, because rest meant dreams and dreams meant terror? The system didn't see him. Not the medic who had bled in the sand, not the soldier who had saved men under fire, not the man who woke every day to fight a battle with no front lines. To them, he was exaggerating. To them, he was a drain. And yet, Daniel had come here, to this courtroom, not to ask for pity, but for dignity. Benefits weren't charity. They were a promise. A promise the nation had made to him, and to every man and woman who wore the uniform. He wasn't asking for riches, he was asking for the chance to live without wondering if he could pay for therapy, without wondering if the roof over his sister's head would hold another month. As he sat at the plaintiff's table, hands trembling, Daniel wasn't just a veteran in a suit too big for him. He was a man carrying every battle he'd ever fought, visible and invisible, into a room that already doubted him. And as Judge Morton leaned back, smirking like the outcome had already been written, Daniel swallowed the familiar truth. Sometimes the hardest war wasn't the one fought overseas. It was the one you fought to be believed. The courthouse clock ticked with a cruel indifference, each second cutting across Daniel's resolve like a razor's edge. For the world beyond those walls, it was just another Wednesday morning. Traffic buzzed through downtown. A mother herded her children across the street toward school. A delivery truck idled outside the bakery. Life pressed forward, ordinary and uninterrupted. But for Daniel Reyes, time had slowed to a crawl. This hearing wasn't just about paperwork, and it wasn't about compensation. It was about acknowledgement, about proving that the invisible wounds he carried were not weakness, not exaggeration, but the real and lingering consequences of a war that had never truly ended for him. Daniel had filed his first claim for disability 3 years earlier, urged by his sister Claire after she found him sitting on the back porch in the middle of the night, shirt drenched in sweat, hands trembling round a cigarette he didn't remember lighting. He had resisted at first. He didn't want to be that guy, the one people said was milking the system. But Claire had looked at him with that steady, unflinching gaze that reminded him she'd carried burdens of her own when their father left. "Danny," she said softly, "you earned this. You don't have to fight alone anymore." But alone was exactly how the process felt. The VA asked for forms, then more forms, then evaluations. He sat across from doctors who measured his pain in minutes, in questionnaires, in checklists. "How often do you have nightmares?" one asked, without looking up from his clipboard. "Do they impair your daily life?" Daniel wanted to laugh. Impair. His entire existence was stitched together with the brittle thread of crowds, of fireworks, of anything that reminded him of the way the world had once sounded when it was collapsing around him. But on paper, it looked neat. Too neat. Denied. The second time, he brought statements from old squad mates. Men who wrote in shaky penmanship about the firefights, about the Humvee, about the bodies Daniel had carried, while rounds cracked the air. The response came in the mail, 6 months later. Insufficient corroborating evidence. The words hit harder than shrapnel, as if the lives he'd saved had vanished into dust, as if memory was too fragile to count as truth. The third time, the language cut sharper still. Symptoms do not meet threshold for full disability compensation. Condition not deemed permanently impairing. Daniel read the letter twice, then 3 times. He set it down on the table, staring at it as if it were written in some other language. Not permanently impairing. As though waking every night at 3 a.m. gasping for air was temporary. As though the sweat-drenched sheets could be explained away. As though the guilt he carried for every man he couldn't save would vanish if he just smiled hard enough. Claire had been furious. She stormed into the kitchen, slammed the letter against the counter, and demanded, "What more do they want? Blood. Your body's already given it." But anger wasn't enough to change the system. Paperwork didn't care about fury. Bureaucracy didn't bleed. So Daniel filed an appeal, knowing the odds were slim. The hearing was the last step, before he'd have to either start over or give up. That was the weight pressing against his chest. Now, as he sat at the plaintiff's table, not the fear of speaking, not the shame of trembling hands, but the knowledge that everything he had endured, the nights he'd fought, battles in silence could be dismissed with a flick of a pen. He wasn't asking for comfort. He wasn't asking to be excused from the hard work of living. He was asking for recognition, for the country that sent him into fire, to admit that the fire had followed him home. Every rejection had made him feel smaller, less visible, less human, and yet here he was again. Not because he believed the system would finally see him, but because he couldn't walk away. Walking away meant accepting that his sacrifice meant nothing. In the silence of the courtroom, Daniel looked down at his shaking hands and whispered a prayer that wasn't really a prayer, just a thought, raw and unpolished. "Please, let someone believe me." What he didn't know not yet was that belief was already walking toward him. It hadn't entered the room, not yet, but soon. And when it did, the lonely fight, he thought, was his alone, would become something larger, something heavier, something the world would no longer be able to ignore. The proceedings began without ceremony, as though the room itself had already decided what the outcome would be. Papers shuffled, the clerk cleared her throat, and Judge Morton leaned forward, peering down from the bench with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he had seen it all. His lips curled at the corners. Not quite a smile, not quite a sneer, but enough to make Daniel feel like a boy standing before the principal's desk, rather than a veteran who had once dragged men from fire. Sergeant Reyes. The judge began, drawing out the title with deliberate slowness. We're here to assess the validity of your claim. This court is not a place for emotion, son. We deal in facts, not feelings. The word son hit Daniel like a slap. It was the same tone he'd heard from drill instructors when they wanted to break you down, except this didn't come with the promise of building him back up. This was meant to belittle, to shrink. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry, and nodded. He wanted to object, to remind the man that his rank had been earned with sweat and blood, not borrowed for sarcasm. But the words lodged in his chest. The state attorney rose smoothly from his chair, his voice crisp and detached. He recited statistics, precedents, case law. To him, Daniel was not a person but a file number, his trauma nothing more than an asterisk on a form. The claimant, he said, not even bothering with Daniel's name, has failed to provide sufficient evidence of impairment that meets the statutory definition of permanent disability. While he may experience occasional nightmares or anxiety, these do not, according to our experts, prevent him from functioning in society. The gallery murmured faintly, the sound of people shifting in their seats. Daniel's hands clenched under the table. Occasional nightmares. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight in years. Anxiety. It wasn't anxiety when your heart pounded so hard at the sound of a car backfiring that you dropped your groceries in the street. It wasn't anxiety when you couldn't walk into a crowded store without mapping every exit in your head. But, to the attorney, it was all clinical, all minimized. Daniel's lawyer, a volunteer from a veterans legal aid group, tried to counter. He spoke about Daniel's service, about his commendations, about the testimonies of his former squad. But Judge Morton wasn't listening. His gaze was elsewhere, on the clock, on his papers, anywhere but on the man sitting before him. When Daniel's lawyer paused, the judge leaned forward and gave a short, sharp laugh. Nightmares and nerves, he said, shaking his head. That's what this case boils down to. Mr. Reyes, plenty of people have trouble sleeping. Plenty of folks get nervous. That doesn't mean they stop living. If we handed out benefits for every bad dream, the treasury would be empty. The words fell like stones into the silence. The chuckle that accompanied them twisted the knife deeper. A few in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One reporter even lowered her pen, but no one spoke. The courtroom air grew heavy with humiliation, thick enough for Daniel to taste. He tried to steady himself, to remember Claire's notes, written neatly in the margins of his folder. Breathe. Speak slowly. Tell the truth. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. Your Honor, with respect, these aren't just bad dreams. There. Morton cut him off with a raised hand. I said we deal in facts. What you're describing is subjective. Unless you've got medical evidence, we can't turn sympathy into policy. He leaned back again, as if the matter was already closed. As if Daniel's life could be dismissed in a single shrug. Daniel sat back, heat crawling up his neck. He had faced death without flinching, but this quiet erasure felt worse. To be told, in front of strangers, that his pain was laughable, that his scars were inconvenient. The gavel might as well have already fallen. In that moment, Daniel realized something brutal. He wasn't just fighting for benefits. He was fighting for recognition that what he carried was real. That the cost he paid wasn't imaginary. That he mattered. And as the judge smirked down at him, Daniel's chest tightened with the awful certainty that to this room, to this system, he was invisible. But invisibility has a way of unraveling when the right eyes see it. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, someone was about to walk through that door who would turn the judge's smirk into silence. Someone whose presence would remind the entire room that facts are more than papers, and dignity is more than words. In the second row, close enough to see her brother's hands tremble, but far enough to avoid the glare of the judge, sat Claire Reyes. She was 28, sharpened and stubborn in the way younger sisters often learn to be, when life hands them more than they asked for. Her notebook was balanced on her lap, pen gripped so tightly between her fingers it threatened to snap. She wasn't an attorney, wasn't a doctor, but she was Daniel's anchor. The one person in the room who saw him not as a case file or a broken soldier but as her brother. The boy who had once fixed her bicycle chain in the middle of a summer thunderstorm so she could ride to her friend's house. The man who had carried her home from a college party when her shoes blistered her feet. Claire had been there when the letters came. She'd watched him open the envelopes, watched his eyes glaze with disbelief as rejection piled on rejection. She'd sat across from him at the kitchen table as he rubbed his temples, whispering, "What do they want from me?" She'd heard the nights when he jolted awake, gasping, his voice hoarse with words from another world, and she had been the one to stand in the doorway, silently guarding him until the shaking passed. Now, in the courtroom, she was helpless. The system didn't care about sisters. It didn't care about family. It cared about codes and statutes, about evidence measured in cold ink instead of lived scars. Still, Claire had come prepared. Her notebook was filled with dates, doctors' names, prescriptions that had changed too often to count. She had documented every sleepless night she knew about. Every time Daniel had left the room, mid-conversation to step outside for air. Every appointment they'd driven to together. If the judge or the attorney asked, she was ready. She had receipts. She had truth. But no one asked. The judge barely acknowledged her existence. The attorney glanced her way only once, eyes skimming past her like she was an inconvenience rather than a witness. Daniel hadn't wanted her to testify, afraid that dragging her into the mess would make her carry even more than she already did. But Claire didn't see it as carrying. She saw it as standing shoulder to shoulder, the same way he had done for her all their lives. As she sat there, the judge's chuckle replayed in her mind like a cruel refrain. That sound, the dismissal of her brother's pain as though it were nothing more than nerves or bad dreams, lit something fierce inside her. She bit her lip, willing herself to stay quiet, to respect the process, but her pen pressed so hard against the page that the ink bled through. She wrote 3 words in all caps. He deserves better. She thought of their mother, now gone, who had prayed every night for Daniel's safety overseas, who had lit candles and written letters even when the mail system couldn't reach him. If she could see this now, the laughter, the smirk, she would have risen from the gallery herself. Claire could almost hear her mother's voice. Don't let them belittle him. Don't let them make him small. Her heart ached as she watched. Daniel tried to steady his voice, only to be silenced by the judge's raised hand. She knew what that silence cost him. It wasn't just humiliation. It was the reopening of old wounds, the confirmation of every whisper that had told him he was weak, that his pain wasn't real. She wanted to stand, to shout, to remind the room of the man he had been in uniform, the medic who had carried not just bodies but hope. Instead, she gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles pale, and whispered under her breath, "They don't see you, Danny, but I do." The gallery shifted around her, reporters scribbling, locals whispering, but Claire sat still, rooted. She wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. If the system wanted to laugh at her brother, then they would have to laugh at her too. If they wanted to erase him, they'd have to erase her along with him. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't see from the plaintiff's table, was that Claire was already his forgotten ally. The one force in the room, unwilling to be silent. And though the judge had power and the attorney had law, Claire had something they didn't: memory. She carried the weight of who her brother was, who he had always been, and she was ready, at any moment, to remind the world of it. Because sometimes, the strongest ally isn't the one with rank or authority. Sometimes it's the one who refuses to let you disappear. And in that sterile courtroom, as Daniel's voice faltered and the judge's smirk grew sharper, Claire's resolve hardened into something unshakable. If no one else would fight for him, she would, even if her voice had to cut through the laughter like a blade. Daniel's lawyer adjusted his tie and gave him a small nod, the kind of signal meant to reassure, but which only made Daniel more aware of how dry his throat was. The courtroom had grown still again, all eyes waiting for him to speak. For a moment, the silence pressed down so heavily that it felt like the air itself had thickened. He swallowed hard, willing his voice to steady. And then he began. "My name is Sergeant Daniel Reyes," he said quietly, his voice rasping but clear. "I served as a combat medic with the 3rd Infantry Division in Iraq. I was deployed to Fallujah in 2008. That's where everything started." He paused, not because he wanted to, but because the memories didn't come in neat, organized lines. They came jagged, broken, splintered by the chaos of war. He forced himself forward. "We were caught in an ambush. An IED flipped one of our Humvees. It was chaos. Smoke. Fire. I remember dragging men out, 12 of them, some alive, some..." His voice faltered. The faces returned, uninvited. Men whose blood had stained his hands, men whose last breaths had rattled against his ear. The judge shifted in his chair, sighing audibly. "We don't need a war story, Sergeant," he said, leaning back with exaggerated patience. "We need facts relevant to your claim." Daniel's lawyer rose quickly. "Your Honor, with respect, this is relevant. His PTSD is directly tied to the combat experiences." Morton lifted a hand, silencing him, then looked down at Daniel. "Go on." if you must. But be brief. Daniel gripped the edges of the table, knuckles pale. He tried again. I see it. At night. Every night. I wake up thinking I'm still there. I can smell the smoke, hear the mortar. Sometimes I can't breathe. My sister, he stopped, his throat closing. Claire's hand gripped her notebook tighter from the gallery. She wanted to shout encouragement, but her eyes did the work instead. Keep going, Danny, keep going. He forced the words out. It's not just dreams. I can't be in crowds. Fireworks send me crawling to the floor. I haven't slept through the night in 6 years. I can't work like I used to. I want to, but his voice cracked, the sentence unfinished. Laughter broke the silence, low and sharp, from the bench. Judge Morton chuckled, shaking his head. Nightmares. Fireworks. Sergeant, with all due respect, plenty of people have trouble sleeping. Plenty of folks jump at loud noises. That doesn't mean they're disabled. The words stung deeper than a bullet. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His chest burned with humiliation, and the air in the courtroom seemed suddenly thinner. His lawyer leaned forward. Your Honor, he's describing classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The VA's own guidelines acknowledge. Guidelines aren't facts, Morton snapped. And what I hear are feelings. This is a court of law, not a therapy session. Daniel looked down at his hands, trembling against the table. He remembered Fallujah, the smell of cordite, the weight of another man's body over his shoulder, the blood sticky on his fatigues. He remembered the way he'd whispered, "L'Issure, gonna be fine, buddy, just hold on," when he knew they weren't fine at all. Those weren't feelings. Those were scars. He lifted his head, voice trembling but defiant. Your Honor, with respect, I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because I gave everything I had over there, and I came back broken. I didn't ask for that, but I did ask for help. And 3 times, they told me no. The gallery shifted, a murmur passing through, like wind through dry leaves. A reporter's pen scratched faster across her pad. An older man in a Vietnam cap lowered his eyes, jaw tight. They understood. They knew this wasn't weakness. It was the truth. But Morton only sighed again, tapping his pen against the bench. We don't have all day, Sergeant. Get to the point. Daniel's lawyer started to speak, but Daniel raised his hand, stopping him. His voice was quiet now, the kind of quiet that carried weight. The point is, Judge, I'm still carrying that battlefield every single day, and you laughing at it doesn't make it go away. The courtroom fell still, the silence sharper than any outburst. Morton's smirk wavered, but only for a heartbeat. Then he leaned back, robe rustling, and muttered, "We'll see." The gavel didn't fall, not yet. But Daniel felt as though it already had. His testimony had been given, raw and unfinished, cut down by impatience. Interrupted not by objections, but by a system that didn't want to hear him. And as he sat back, chest tight, he realized something cruel. Sometimes the greatest wound wasn't the one inflicted in war, but the one reopened when the world refused to listen. A courtroom is meant to feel impartial, neutral ground where truth is weighed and measured. But as Daniel Reyes sat there, his testimony dismissed, and his words left hanging in the stale air, the room didn't feel impartial at all. It felt hostile. It felt like the walls themselves leaned toward the bench, siding with the authority, who had just laughed at him. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, an orchestra of small movements. A cough from the back row, the creak of wooden benches, the rustle of jackets, as people leaned toward one another to whisper. Some looked at Daniel with pity, others with skepticism. To the ones who had wandered in, expecting nothing more than a legal curiosity. His pain was entertainment, a story to be consumed, then forgotten. To the bureaucrats present, it was merely another case in a long docket. But to Daniel, every whisper, every sideways glance felt like a verdict, long before the judge would give. His reporters scribbled faster than before. Their pens danced across pages, not to preserve the truth of what was happening, but to capture the drama of a veteran, unraveling in public. Daniel could imagine the headlines. Bronze Star recipient breaks down in courtroom. Or worse, judge questions legitimacy of PTSD claim. They wouldn't print the nights he'd spent on his sister's couch, shaking and gasping for air. They wouldn't print the way fireworks had sent him crawling for cover, heart racing until he vomited. No, they'd print the laughter, the dismissals, the sound bites, sharp enough to bleed. In the front row, 2 older men sat with caps perched on their heads. One bore the faded patchwork insignia of Vietnam service. The other Desert Storm. They said nothing, but their silence wasn't indifference. Their eyes told the truth. They'd been here before, sitting in the same seats, hearing the same laughter, feeling the same dismissal. To them, Daniel wasn't just one man fighting the system. He was the newest in a long line of brothers who had returned home, only to be told their battles didn't count. Claire saw all of it. She saw the way people tilted their heads at her brother like he was some animal on display. She heard the whispered judgments. Maybe he's exaggerating. Maybe he's just looking for a handout. Her blood boiled, but she kept her place, scribbling notes with furious precision. If no one else remembered the truth of this day, she would. The bailiff leaned against the wall, impassive, though even his brow creased when the judge had laughed. It wasn't procedure to comment, wasn't his role to intervene, but in the subtle shift of his posture, in the way his jaw tightened, there was a silent acknowledgement. Even he knew the line had been crossed. Daniel sat still, though stillness was its own battle. His leg bounced beneath the table, foot tapping against the linoleum in an involuntary rhythm. His hands had settled flat against the wood, but sweat dampened the edges of the papers beneath his palms. The silence that followed his last words stretched longer than it should have. Until it wasn't silence anymore, it was suffocation. Judge Morton leaned back, scanning the courtroom as though daring someone to object, daring someone to question his authority. No one did. He wore that power like a cloak, heavy and smug. His smirk returned, just faintly, but enough for Daniel to notice. Enough to drive the humiliation deeper. It was then that Daniel realized how alone he felt. Not because his sister wasn't there, he knew she was, her presence steady behind him. Not because his lawyer wasn't competent, he was trying, though hopelessly outmatched by the indifference of the bench. No, Daniel felt alone, because the room had already chosen sides. And he wasn't on the winning one. The mood grew heavier by the minute. Every second that ticked on the courtroom clock added weight to Daniel's chest. It wasn't the kind of weight he had felt on the battlefield, where adrenaline kept his body moving, despite the chaos. This was worse. This was the weight of invisibility. From the gallery, someone finally muttered, just loud enough to carry tax dollars at work. A few chuckled, a dry and callous sound that cut sharper than any bullet. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For one fragile second, he let himself imagine being back in Fallujah, because it was easier. But because at least there, no one doubted why he was fighting. The courtroom air thickened with unspoken judgment. To some, Daniel was a hero turned beggar. To others, he was proof that the system was clogged with frivolous claims. Only a handful saw him for what he was, a man still carrying the battlefield, forced to justify the very scars that had saved others' lives. And yet, even as the mood pressed harder against him, Daniel held on. He'd faced worse. He'd survived. Worse. What he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom yet sensed, was that the atmosphere was about to shift. The air, heavy with dismissal and doubt, would soon be pierced by something undeniable. Something that would remind every person in that room that Daniel Reyes wasn't a case file or a symptom list. He was a soldier. And soldiers don't disappear quietly. Claire's hand shook as she wrote, her pen dragging hard lines across the page that were more fury than notes. She had promised Daniel she would stay calm, promised she wouldn't make a scene. But promises were fragile things when you watched your brother, the same boy who once walked you home in the dark when you were 12. The same man who patched strangers up under enemy fire, be laughed at like a child making excuses. She could see his shoulders rounding, the way shame crept into his posture, like fog seeping into a valley. That wasn't her brother. That wasn't the man who had carried 12 men out of the fire. That was what humiliation did, what dismissal did, and she couldn't sit still. Her notebook snapped shut with a sound louder than she intended. Heads turned in the gallery. Claire pushed herself to her feet, the wood of the bench creaking beneath her as she rose. Her voice came out sharp, trembling, at first, but gaining strength with every word. "Enough," she said. The judge's head jerked up, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Claire stepped forward, clutching her notebook like a weapon. "You laughed at him." My brother stood in the middle of a war zone while men bled out around him, and he didn't flinch. He carried them when no one else could. "And you laughed at him." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. A reporter's pen froze mid-stroke. The bailiff shifted, uncertain whether to move or wait for the judge's command. Morton slammed his gavel, the sharp crack echoing off the sterile walls. "Sit down, young lady, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." But Claire didn't move. Her cheeks burned, her throat thick with a rage that had lived inside her since the first denial. Letter arrived in their mailbox. "You don't see him." she pressed on, her voice ringing. All you see is paperwork and schedules. But I see him. I see the nights he wakes up gasping for air. I see the way he checks every lock on the doors twice because his mind won't let him feel safe. I see the way he hasn't slept through the night in 6 years. And you dare to laugh. Daniel's head was bowed, but his hand trembled against the table. Not with shame this time, but with something else. Pride, fear, gratitude. He wanted to tell her to stop, to sit, to protect herself from the wrath of authority. But his voice wouldn't come. The judge pounded the gavel again, his face flushed. Bailiff asterisk, but the bailiff hesitated. He looked from the judge to Claire, then back again, his jaw tight. He didn't move. Claire's voice softened then, but it carried even stronger. You're supposed to be the one who listens, who weighs truth. My brother gave this country everything, and all he asks is for recognition of what he still carries. If he can't see that, then maybe the wrong person is wearing the robe. The room went still. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade under the weight of her words. For a moment, time stretched. The tension so thick it felt like a thread about to snap. Judge Morton's mouth pressed into a thin line. His pride was wounded, his authority challenged. That's enough, he growled. Sit down, or I will clear this courtroom. Claire didn't move. Not right away. Her eyes locked on his, unflinching, daring him to erase her the way he was trying to erase Daniel. Finally, she turned, placed her hand gently on the back of her brother's chair, and whispered, so only he could hear, they don't see you, Danny, but I do, and I won't stop. Asterisk then, slowly, she returned to her seat. The judge exhaled sharply, robes rustling as he settled back, muttering something under his breath. But the room had changed. The gallery was no longer a passive audience. People shifted forward on their benches. The veterans in the front row nodded once, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. Claire's words had struck deeper than the gavel's crack. Daniel lifted his head. His hands still trembled, but there was a steadiness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since the hearing began, he didn't feel invisible. His sister had pulled him back into the light. What Claire couldn't know, what none of them could, was that her defiance had opened the door for something larger. The air in the room had shifted, waiting. And soon, that shift would become an earthquake. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the sound of a hinge creaking broke through the tension. At first it was so ordinary, so small, that no one turned. Just the heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom, easing open against its frame. But then came the light sunlight spilling across the floor in a bright stripe. As if the outside world had pushed its way into this stale chamber of buzzing lights and stale air. Heads turned, whispers fluttered. Even Judge Morton glanced up, irritated at the interruption. The door didn't swing open quickly. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though whoever pushed it knew that silence itself was watching. Daniel lifted, his eyes, heart thudding against his ribs. The scrape of boots followed, steady and unhurried, each step echoing against the linoleum with the crisp cadence of discipline. Not the shuffle of a curious onlooker, not the hurried step of a late attorney. This was something else, something weightier. The bailiff straightened from his post, eyes narrowing. He knew that sound. So did the veterans in the front row, who exchanged glances without speaking. Their spines straightened instinctively, their shoulders stiffening, as if an old muscle memory had jolted awake. From where he sat at the plaintiff's table, Daniel caught only glimpses at first. The shine of polished black shoes, the dark blue fabric of a uniform coat, the faint glint of brass buttons catching the sterile fluorescent light. And then, above it all, a row of ribbons pinned high and proud. Each ribbon a story, each color a scar carried with dignity. The gallery gasped in a ripple, like a wave rolling from back to front. Phones rose discreetly, lenses catching the impossible. A woman in the second row whispered, "Is that?" But the rest of her sentence dissolved into the hum of awe. The man who entered filled the room, without needing to raise his voice or even his head. His presence was enough. He was tall, shoulders squared beneath the weight of medals and years. His hair was steel gray, cropped to regulation. His jaw was stern, but his eyes, when they lifted, were sharp with clarity. The kind of clarity only forged in the fire of command. General Marcus Halstead. 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder. Commander of U.S. Central Command. A man who had directed entire theaters of war, who had sat in rooms with presidents and prime ministers, who had seen nations rise and fall, and yet here he was, stepping into a county courthouse in Georgia. Unannounced, uninvited, but not unwelcome. The bailiff opened his mouth to announce him, then stopped. What could he say? Everyone already knew. Titles weren't necessary when respect arrived wearing its own armor. Judge Morton stiffened in his chair, his earlier smirk faltering. Authority was supposed to rest solely with him inside these four walls. But the weight of Halstead's presence unsettled the balance. For the first time that morning, the judge looked small. Daniel stared, unable to breathe. His mind scrambled for explanation. Why was he here? Why now? He had only ever seen the general from afar on a tarmac, giving orders through the chaos of dust and fire. He had never expected their paths to cross again. Not like this. Not in the middle of his humiliation. The general did not rush. He moved with the calm certainty of a man used to walking into rooms that bent under his presence. He reached the center island, stopped, boots striking the floor, with one last echo that silenced even the whispers. His eyes swept the courtroom once, pausing on Daniel. The connection was instant. Recognition flashed off of a name on a file, not of a soldier among thousands, but of a moment burned into memory. A medic pulling him from twisted metal, hands bloody, voice steady, despite the chaos. A life saved when death had already marked its claim. Daniel's breath caught. The general's expression softened almost imperceptibly. And then, in front of the judge, the attorney, the gallery, he raised his hand to his brow and delivered a crisp, unshakable salute. The air shifted. No one moved. No one spoke. Authority had just changed hands, and every person in the room felt it. The door had opened, yes. But it wasn't just the oak and the hinges. It was the door to something larger, something that would not be laughed away. Daniel Reyes was no longer alone at the plaintiff's table. The war had just walked back in, and it had come wearing stars. The salute hung in the air like a flag caught in a sudden gust, sharp, undeniable, unshakable. For a moment, the entire courtroom forgot to breathe. The kind of silence that followed wasn't the emptiness of pause, but the stunned reverence of a crowd, realizing it was in the presence of something far greater than itself. General Marcus Halstead lowered his hand with precision. His posture, unbending. Every medal on his chest gleamed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. And though the setting was a county courthouse with peeling paint and buzzing bulbs, he made it feel like the deck of an aircraft carrier, like a parade ground, where history was written. Daniel sat frozen, his throat closed, his chest tight, the world spinning around the one impossible truth before him. General Halstead, the man he had once pulled from a wreck, bleeding and trapped under twisted steel, while mortar rained down, and the air itself seemed to burn. Daniel remembered his hands slick with blood, remembered whispering steady reassurances into the ear of a commander he barely knew. He had never told anyone that story in detail. He hadn't needed to. The ribbons on Halstead's chest now confirmed what Daniel had once tried to forget. Those moments had mattered. They had mattered to someone who had lived to remember them. Asterisk, the gallery whispered like wind across a wheat field, rippling in waves. That's him. Oh my God, it's the general. What's he doing here? Phones lifted higher, pen scribbled, faster, but none of it could capture the gravity of what was unfolding. Halstead's boots echoed as he moved forward. Each step a drumbeat. He didn't rush, didn't falter. He stopped directly in the center of the courtroom, squared himself to the bench, and let the weight of his presence settle. Judge Morton, so smug and dismissive moments earlier, suddenly shifted in his seat, tugging at his robe as if it had grown too heavy. His smirk was gone, replaced with something smaller in certainty. Your Honor, Halstead said, his voice resonant, the kind of voice that had once cut through chaos on a battlefield. I beg the court's indulgence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Authority lived in his tone, in the calm gravity of words that carried decades of command. Morton cleared his throat, grasping for control. General Halstead, this is highly irregular. Court proceedings. Do not. Halstead lifted one gloved hand, not rudely, not arrogantly, but with the kind of finality that made interruptions unthinkable. So is laughing at a man's wounds. The words landed like a blast. No one dared move. The judge's face reddened, his lips pressed into a thin line. But he didn't argue. The general turned then, slowly, his gaze settling on Daniel. The medic, who had once been just another uniform in the dust, now sat before him. Smaller, diminished by years of silent battles the world refused to see, and yet Halstead's eyes softened. Respect radiated from him like heat. Sergeant Reyes, he said, voice steady, this nation owes you more than it could ever repay. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. His sister Claire, seated behind him, pressed her hand to her mouth, tears brimming. For all her fury, all her defiance, Even she had not expected this. The general turned back to the bench. I am here because this man saved my life in Fallujah. He dragged me out from beneath a burning Humvee, while rounds snapped overhead. I would not be standing here if not for him, and yet today, I find him forced to defend his very humanity in front of a court that dares to laugh at his scars. Gasps rippled. Reporters' pens scratched so fast, they nearly tore through their pads. One of the veterans in the front row lifted his cap and pressed it to his chest. Judge Morton shifted again, struggling to maintain authority, but the room no longer belonged to him. Authority had crossed the threshold with Marcus Halstead, and no robe, no gavel, could overshadow it. Halstead's words carried further. I have served 40 years, Your Honor. I have commanded thousands of men. And I tell you now, courage is not measured in statutes or paperwork. It is measured in nights survived, in burdens carried long after the battlefield has gone silent. Sergeant Reyes has carried more than most men ever could, and instead of honor, he has been handed dismissal. The silence that followed was thick, electric. The air vibrated with something larger than law, larger than the narrow lines of procedure. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel like a man on trial. He felt seen, truly seen. And as the general stood tall in that sterile courtroom, the laughter that had once tried to erase Daniel Reyes was buried beneath the weight of truth. The general's words had not yet settled into silence before the gallery erupted into a tide of whispers. It was not noise exactly, but the hushed frenzy of disbelief, awe, and something else that carried weight respect. The sound filled every corner of the courtroom, spilling over the oak benches and bouncing off the high ceiling. Reporters leaned into one another, scribbling furiously, their pens unable to keep pace with what their eyes were recording. Headlines wrote themselves in ink. Four-star general testifies in defense of local veteran WHL1. Young journalist mouthed the words career-making story to her colleague. But even she, caught in her ambition, couldn't hide the widening of her eyes. Phones tilted discreetly upward. In a world where news broke faster than gavels could strike, images of General Halstead in full-dress blues, standing in a small Georgia courtroom, spread like wildfire. The gallery, so restless and dismissive an hour before, now leaned forward, every spine straight, every breath shallow. Among them, veterans shifted in their seats. The old man in the Vietnam cap removed it, pressing the fabric to his chest, as if standing at a memorial wall. The Desert Storm vet beside him whispered something low and reverent. That's ironclad Halstead, a name spoken with the quiet all-soldiers, reserved for leaders, who had walked through fire alongside them. Even those who had doubted Daniel, who had whispered about taxpayers and handouts, sat differently now. Their skepticism faltered under the sheer gravity of the general's presence. For if a man who commanded armies, who bore ribbons across his chest, like chapters of history, had come here unbidden to stand for Daniel Reyes, then surely there was more truth in Daniel's scars than any dismissal could erase. Daniel himself sat in stunned silence. His hands still trembled against the table, but the tremor felt different now. Not humiliation, not fear. It was the trembling of a dam straining against the flood. He could not understand how the man he once dragged from rubble had appeared here, in this room, at this moment. He remembered the weight of Halstead's body, heavy with blood and dust. The way the general's eyes had locked on his even then, wordless but alive. And now, years later, those same eyes met his again, steady and sure, as if to say, I remember, and I will not let them forget. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She gripped her brother's shoulder from behind, the pressure steady, grounding. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let herself dissolve. She wanted Daniel to see only strength reflected in her eyes. For all her defiance earlier, even she had not dared imagine this, a general of 4 stars, walking into a county courthouse to defend her brother. The judge shifted uncomfortably. His earlier smirk evaporated, his authority slipping like sand through clenched fists. He tapped his pen against the bench, a hollow, nervous sound, and muttered something about procedure. But his voice was lost beneath the tide of whispers rising around him. He was no longer the center of gravity. The room had turned. The bailiff, still at his post near the door, straightened fully now. His eyes flicked to Daniel, then to Halstead, and for the first time that morning, his stiff neutrality cracked. His chin dipped, just slightly, in acknowledgement. The kind of nod soldiers give one another when words are unnecessary. A mother, in the second row, leaned toward her teenage son, whispering, "That's the kind of man your father used to talk about." The boy stared wide-eyed at Halstead, as if glimpsing the embodiment of every story told at the dinner table. In the back, another woman murmured, "If the general came all this way for him, then that veteran must have done something extraordinary." Extraordinary. The word echoed in Daniel's chest, though he didn't feel it. He didn't feel extraordinary. He felt tired, worn. But in this moment, with whispers rippling like a current around him, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his pain wasn't invisible after all. The judge cleared his throat loudly, banging the gavel once, trying to summon silence back under his control. The whispers quieted, but the mood did not return to neutrality. It couldn't. The gallery had been transformed. They had seen authority in its truest form, not robes, not titles, but lived respect. And no gavel could erase that dot for Daniel Reyes. The battle had always felt lonely, but in that instant, hearing the whispers swell into reverent silence, he realized something profound. The loneliness was ending. And with the general's presence anchoring the room, the fight was no longer his alone. Daniel had spent years feeling like a ghost in plain sight, alive, yes, but invisible in the ways that mattered. The VA letters, the cold examinations, the dismissive laughter of strangers, all of it carved a cruel message into his bones. No one sees you. But now, as General Marcus Halstead's gaze locked on his, that lie began to splinter. The recognition came not in words at first, but in the silence between them. It was the kind of silence forged in fire, the kind that carried memory too deep for language. Daniel remembered the wreckage of the Humvee, flames licking at the edges of twisted steel, his own heartbeat pounding so loud he thought it might drown out the gunfire. He remembered the weight of Halstead's body, the sharp cry of torn muscle. When he pulled him free, the smell of smoke and sand clinging to them both. He had whispered, "Stay with me, sir. Just stay with me," though his own lungs burned with dust. Now, years later, Halstead's eyes told him plainly, "I stayed because of you." The courtroom, frozen under the general's presence, shifted into something sacred. No one dared move. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim, as though reluctant to intrude. Daniel's throat tightened. For so long he had carried those moments in silence, unsure if they mattered, unsure if anyone remembered. And yet here was proof, not in paperwork, not in signatures, but in the flesh and blood presence of a man whose very survival testified to Daniel's courage. Halstead stepped forward, his polished boots striking deliberate rhythms against the floor. Each sound echoed with a cadence Daniel had once heard in desert marches, a rhythm that spoke of discipline, of certainty. He stopped just beside the plaintiff's table. The general's shadow stretched across Daniel's trembling hands. "Sergeant Reyes," Halstead said, his voice low but clear, "I know you." The gallery gasped at the words, though they were simple. To Daniel, they were everything. "You pulled me out when the fire was closing in. You patched wounds I didn't think I'd survive, and you carried me farther than I thought a single man could. That day in Fallujah, I gave orders. But you," Halstead's voice thickened slightly, "you gave me my life." Daniel blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. His chest heaved with a breath that trembled on its way out. He had not expected this. He had come into the courtroom bracing for humiliation, preparing for the judge's sneer, for the attorney's condescension. He had not prepared for recognition. The judge shifted in his chair, his gavel hand twitching as if itching to reclaim control. "General, with respect," Morton said, his voice thinner than before. "This testimony is highly irregular." Halstead turned, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp enough to cut through marble. "Irregular. So is dismissing the scars of a man who saved lives while this nation slept in peace. Irregular is laughing at wounds you cannot see." The words struck hard. No one in the gallery so much as coughed. Even the reporters paused, their pens frozen, absorbing every syllable. Halstead looked back to Daniel, his tone softening. "You are not invisible. You are not weak. You are the reason men like me came home to families, to futures, and it's time this court and this country remembered that." Daniel's hands trembled harder, but it was not the tremor of shame. It was the release of years spent unseen, the sudden weight of recognition settling onto him like armor. Claire pressed her hand to his shoulder again, whispering through tears, "He remembers, Danny. He remembers." For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe the war he had carried wasn't just his. Maybe someone else carried it, too, someone powerful enough to make the world listen. And as Halstead's words lingered in the still air, Daniel felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever: dignity. Recognition wasn't just acknowledgement. It was reclamation. And in that courtroom, beneath the shadow of 4 stars, Daniel Reyes reclaimed a piece of himself the system had tried to take. The moment seemed to fold in on itself, stretched thin between past and present. Daniel sat frozen, still absorbing the general's words, when something happened he had never imagined, in his lowest moments, not in his rarest dreams. General Marcus Halstead straightened his spine, heels clicking together with military precision, and in front of the entire courtroom, he raised his right hand to his brow in a crisp salute. The soundless gesture cut sharper than any gavel. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A reporter dropped her pen, the faint clatter startling in the silence. The veteran in the Vietnam cap stood abruptly, his own trembling hand rising instinctively to mirror the salute. Others followed, one by one. Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan men, and women who had come to watch quietly but now found themselves rising, honoring not the general, but the medic he saluted. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath hitched in disbelief. For a split second, his mind raced backward to Fallujah, to the smell of burning fuel and scorched earth, to the desperate weight of dragging Halstead from the wreck. In that chaos, there had been no ceremony, no solitary survival. He had never expected thanks. He had never wanted it. But here it was, delivered not in words, but in the universal language of respect. His throat burned. His hands trembled against the table, but this time he did not try to still them. He let the tears prick the corners of his eyes, let the weight of the moment sink into his bones. A general, a man whose very uniform commanded nations, was saluting him. Him. Judge Morton shifted in his chair, visibly rattled. His authority, so absolute minutes before, now looked fragile, almost brittle under the weight of the gesture. He cleared his throat, his voice struggling to reclaim control. General Halstead, this is highly unorthodox. Court protocol does not. The general's hand lowered with practiced precision. He turned his gaze on the judge.com, but unyielding. Protocol does not define honor. Your honor. Men like Sergeant Reyes do. The silence that followed was thicker than before, the kind of silence that seemed to expand, filling the corners of the room until there was no space left for doubt. Even the harsh fluorescent lights seemed subdued, as if unwilling to intrude on something sacred. Claire's tears finally spilled, sliding unchecked down her cheeks. She had spent years trying to convince her brother that his pain mattered, that his sacrifice had not gone unseen. She had whispered it in kitchens, written it in notebooks, screamed it in her mind, when the world refused to listen. But now, watching the general's salute, she realized she no longer needed to be the only one saying it. Someone else, someone who carried the weight of stars on his shoulders, had spoken louder than she ever could. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he whispered, almost too softly for anyone to hear. Sir, you don't have to, Halstead interrupted gently, his tone steady but carrying enough weight to anchor the entire room. I do. Because you carried me when no one else could. Because you bore a burden that this nation has forgotten too easily. And because a man like you deserves to stand recognized, not dismissed. The words wrapped around Daniel like a shield, firm and unshakable. For the first time in years, the tremor in his hands didn't feel like weakness. It felt like release. The gallery sat stunned, their whispers replaced by reverent silence. Phones still recorded, pens still scribbled, but no one looked away. They all knew they were witnessing something larger than a hearing, something more enduring than a case number. Judge Morton fumbled with his pen, tapping it nervously against the bench. He looked smaller than he had moments before, diminished by the sheer weight of the respect radiating through the room. The robe, the gavel, the bench, none of it could compete with the authority of a salute. Daniel lowered his head for a moment, breathing deeply. When he looked up again, his eyes met the general's, steady and sure. And though no words passed between them, the message was clear. I see you. I will not let them forget you. The salute had done more than honor a man. It had shattered the silence of invisibility, torn through the layers of dismissal and humiliation. It had shifted the ground beneath the courtroom itself. For Daniel Reyes, it was not just recognition. It was vindication. And for the first time since stepping into the room, he allowed himself to truly believe that the battle was turning. The echo of the salute had not yet faded when General Marcus Halstead stepped forward, his boots striking the linoleum with the same steady cadence Daniel remembered from desert marches. Every move was deliberate, measured, as though each step was meant to anchor the courtroom in truth. He stopped at the center of the floor, turned to face the bench, and let his silence linger. Silence, after all, was its own kind of command. When he finally spoke, his voice carried without effort. It wasn't loud, but it resonated with the calm authority of a man who had issued orders under fire. A man who understood that words could steady troops as surely as they could rally them. "Your Honor," Halstead began, his tone even, "you may not respect him, but I do." The statement cut through the courtroom like a blade. The judge's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The gallery stirred, people leaning forward, as if the general's words were not just argument, but revelation. Halstead's gaze shifted, sweeping across the room before fixing again on Daniel. "That man saved my life," he continued, each syllable deliberate. "In Fallujah, when I was pinned under wreckage, when rounds tore the air and the world was collapsing into fire, he didn't hesitate. He dragged me free, patched my wounds, and carried me farther than I had any right to expect. Courage like that doesn't come cheap, Your Honor. It costs. And the cost does not vanish when the battlefield falls silent." Daniel sat motionless, his hands trembling faintly against the table. He remembered every detail, the twisted Humvee, the smoke, the chaos, but he had never spoken it aloud in this way. To hear it now, spoken not by him, but by the very man whose life he had pulled back from the edge, felt surreal. It was as though his memories had been lifted out of his chest and placed before the world for all to see. The judge shifted, visibly uncomfortable. "General, while your testimony is dramatic, this court must rely on documented medical evidence, not stories." Of Halstead's head turned sharply, his gaze pinning Morton like a soldier caught shirking duty. "Stories? You call them stories?" "No, Your Honor. They are facts. I am the living evidence of Sergeant Reyes' service. And I tell you now, what he endured that day and every day since would shatter most men." The gallery erupted in murmurs, gasps punctuating the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across paper like sparks. A veteran in the front row muttered, "Damn right," his voice thick with conviction. Claire's grip tightened on Daniel's shoulder. She felt his chest rise and fall, faster than before, but steadier somehow. Tears clung to her lashes, but her jaw was firm. For years she had begged people to see what Daniel carried. Now, finally, someone with stars on his shoulders was holding that truth aloft. Halstead didn't stop. He turned fully to the judge, his voice softening, but losing none of its weight. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity. You don't need medals or reports to recognize the scars of a man who gave everything and came home with less of himself than he left with. And yet here, in this courtroom, he has been laughed at. Laughed at." Morton flinched, the word echoing like an accusation. The general's gaze sharpened further. "I've led men into fire, Judge. I've buried them when they didn't come back. I've seen courage, and I've seen cowardice. Let me be clear. Sergeant Reyes is courage, and your laughter is cowardice." A hush fell, heavier than before. Even the buzzing lights seemed too quiet. The air in the room vibrated with the weight of the declaration. Halstead turned slightly, looking back to Daniel. His tone softened again, the words carrying a personal gravity. "You gave me my life, and I will not stand silent while yours is diminished." Daniel's throat tightened. He could not speak. He could only nod, once, slowly, as if to acknowledge that the battle he had fought alone had finally been joined. The courtroom was no longer a chamber of dismissal. It had become a field of reckoning. And in that moment, with the general's words ringing in their ears, everyone present understood. The tide had turned. For a long, fragile moment, no one in the room dared to move. The general's words hovered in the stale air like smoke after a gunshot, too heavy to disperse, too sharp to ignore. Even the fluorescent lights seemed subdued, buzzing lower, as though they too were aware that something sacred had just been spoken. Daniel sat utterly still, his chest rising and falling in shallow waves. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, but for the first time, the weight of that attention wasn't humiliation, it was recognition. His trembling hands rested flat against the table, but the tremor now seemed less like weakness and more like the last vibrations of a storm passing through. The gallery, which had been so quick to whisper and judge earlier, now leaned forward in reverent silence. Reporters froze mid-sentence, their pens suspended in air, unsure how to capture a moment that was bigger than headlines. Even the skeptical murmurers from the back row, the ones who had snickered about tax dollars and handouts, sat with lips pressed shut, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Judge Morton, who had been so smug, so dismissive, found himself suddenly adrift. He shifted in his herbaceous chair, robes rustling, tapping his pen against the bench with nervous impatience. But the sound was swallowed by the silence. Authority no longer radiated from his gavel. It radiated from the 4 stars on General Halstead's shoulders, from the dignity carried in his voice, from the invisible scars on the man sitting at the plaintiff's table. The bailiff, still at his post near the door, straightened until his shoulders touched the wall. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on Daniel. It was the look of a man who had worn a uniform once himself, the look of recognition that said, "I know. I've seen it too." He didn't speak, but the slight dip of his head, almost imperceptible, was enough. Claire sat frozen, her hand still on her brother's shoulder. Her knuckles were white from gripping too hard, but she didn't loosen her hold. She had dreamed of this moment, of someone in power finally saying what she had screamed in silence for years, yet when it arrived, it broke her in ways she hadn't expected. Tears slid down her cheeks freely now, and she didn't wipe them away. She wanted Daniel to see them, to know she wasn't crying out of pity but out of fierce, unyielding pride. Daniel closed his eyes for a heartbeat. In the dark behind his eyelids, Fallujah returned us, fire, the deafening crash of metal, the taste of ash in his mouth. But this time, something new overlaid the memory. A voice, steady and certain. "You are not invisible. You are not weak." He opened his eyes, and the room was still holding its breath. The silence itself had become a verdict not yet spoken aloud, but already felt. It pressed against Morton, who fumbled with his notes, muttering about procedure, about proper channels. But even he seemed to realize that words now would clang hollow against the weight of what had just been witnessed. Daniel's lawyer leaned forward, whispering, This changes everything." His tone was reverent, almost shaken. He had expected to argue statutes, to cite cases. He had not expected a general to walk in and rewrite the narrative with truth that no document could rival. The silence deepened, and in it, something shifted inside Daniel. For years, he had carried the sense that his life had narrowed, that the war had reduced him to a list of symptoms and denials. But here, now, the silence was not suffocating, it was reverent. It was the sound of people listening, truly listening. For the first time in years, General Halstead remained at the center of the room, his posture unbending, his presence immovable. He did not glance at the judge. He did not need to. The silence itself testified louder than any cross-examination. And then, finally, Daniel exhaled. A long, shaky breath, but steady at the end. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. But in the silence it carried, "Thank you, sir." The general's eyes met his, a slight nod in return, a soldier's acknowledgement. No more words were needed. The silence lingered, heavy and sacred, binding everyone present to a truth they could not deny. Sergeant Daniel Reyes was no longer invisible. The battlefield he had carried alone had been placed before them all, and none of them, not the judge, not the attorney, not the whispering gallery, would ever be able to unsee it. General Halstead remained in the center of the room, the silence folding around him like a mantle. His eyes stayed fixed on Judge Morton, but when he spoke again, it wasn't to argue law or quote policy. It was to tell a story, the kind of story that can't be cross-examined away, because it lives too vividly in the memory of the one who survived it. "I remember the day," Halstead began, his tone slow, deliberate. "Fallujah 2008. The air thick with smoke and sand. Mortar screaming so close, the ground itself shuddered. My Humvee struck an eye and rolled, trapping me beneath it. I was bleeding, my leg crushed, vision fading. My men thought I was gone." The gallery leaned forward, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Even the court reporter's keystrokes slowed, her fingers hesitant, because the weight of what was being said didn't feel like mere testimony, felt like confession. Halstead continued, his gaze distant now, fixed on something only he could see. "I remember the heat on my face, the smell of burning rubber, the sound of men shouting orders I couldn't hear. And then through all of that chaos there was him." He turned his eyes toward Daniel. Sergeant Reyes, a medic, younger than most, but steady as stone. He didn't flinch when rounds cracked overhead. He didn't hesitate when fire licked at his boots. He pulled me free with a strength I still can't explain, and when my blood was soaking through his uniform, when I was slipping into shock, he pressed his hands to my wounds and said, "Stay with me, sir. Just stay with me." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat thick, but he didn't look away. The memories he had buried so deeply came rushing back, not as nightmares now, but as truth spoken aloud. He could almost feel the heat again, the grit in his teeth, the desperate pounding of his own heart. Halstead's voice softened, carrying the intimacy of memory. He carried me across open ground, while mortars struck around us. I remember looking up, seeing the sky split with fire, and wondering how he could keep moving. But he did, step after step, refusing to let me go. When we reached cover, he worked on me like there was no one else in the world. He saved my leg. He saved my life. The words landed heavy in the room. No one dared to speak. Even Morton's frown faltered, his lips pressed tight, as if he were chewing on the undeniable. Halstead drew a slow breath. Do you know what courage looks like, Your Honor? It's not medals or parades. It's not clean uniforms or polished boots. It's a young man with trembling hands who steadies them long enough to hold back death. It's the medic who whispers lies. You're going to be fine, because he knows hope is as necessary as oxygen. That is courage. And that is Sergeant Reyes. Claire's tears flowed freely now, her notebook forgotten on her lap. She had heard fragments of this story before, half-muttered pieces Daniel let slip on nights when sleep wouldn't come. But to hear it whole, to hear it validated by the man who owed his life to it, broke something open inside her. She squeezed Daniel's shoulder, whispering, Do you hear him? Do you hear what he sees in you? Daniel's vision blurred, but he nodded. He had spent years thinking his actions in Fallujah were buried in sand, lost to time, carried only in nightmares. But now, in this sterile courtroom, the truth was being resurrected. Halstead's voice grew firmer, filling the room. This court questions whether his wounds impair his life. Let me tell you, the wounds you cannot see are the heaviest to carry. He carried me through fire, and now he carries that fire inside him every day. To dismiss that is to dismiss sacrifice itself. The gallery erupted in a low murmur of assent. Veterans nodded, reporters scribbled. A mother clutched her child's hand tightly, and in that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of judgment. It was a witness stand not for Daniel, but for the truth of what he had lived, carried, and survived. General Halstead had placed it all before them, not as a favor, not as sentiment, but as fact, and the weight of it was undeniable. Judge Morton had spent years presiding over hearings with the confidence of a man who believed the robe itself made him untouchable. He knew procedure, precedent, and paperwork. He knew how to silence a witness with a raised hand, how to cut short a lawyer with a single sharp word. But in this moment, beneath the steady weight of General Halstead's account, he looked smaller. Stripped of the easy arrogance he had worn like armor, his gavel sat within reach, but he didn't touch it. His pen, which had earlier clicked and tapped with casual dismissal, now lay flat on the bench, forgotten. He shifted in his chair, his face pinched, and cleared his throat once, twice, as if stalling for time. General Halstead, he began, his voice thinner than before, with respect. This court must operate under rules of evidence. Dramatic recollections, however moving, cannot substitute for medical documentation. Halstead's gaze cut into him, sharp as steel. So is laughing at a man's trauma in open court, the general said evenly. The words hit with the force of artillery. Morton's jaw snapped shut. He blinked, visibly taken aback. And for a long moment he stared at the man before him, the uniform, the medals, the weight of decades of service etched into his face. It was one thing to dismiss a struggling veteran with trembling hands. It was another to dismiss a four-star general who had commanded wars and carried men home. Draped in flags, the gallery seemed to sense the shift. They leaned forward, eyes darting between bench and uniform, waiting to see if Morton would push back. The veterans in the front row sat straighter, silent but expectant. Even the reporters paused mid-scribble, pens hovering in the air like arrows, waiting to be loosed. Morton licked his lips, trying to recover ground. General, I do not question your service. I do not question Sergeant Reyes' bravery. But this hearing is about benefits, not about honor. We must abide by the Halstead. Stepped closer, not with aggression but with an undeniable authority that made every word land like command. Benefits are not charity. They are promises. Promises written into the very fabric of this nation. A soldier does not leave his post until relieved. Yet here sits a man who has never been relieved of his duty, because his battlefield followed him home. And you, his voice sharpened, you laughed at him. The silence after those words was crushing. Morton opened his mouth, but nothing came. He glanced at the gallery, perhaps searching for support, but saw only eyes fixed on him, unblinking, unkind. Even the skeptical faces were gone now. No one would side with laughter after what they had heard. Claire rose slightly from her bench, her voice clear but calm. You heard him, Your Honor. My brother saved lives. He saved this man's life, and you mocked him. Morton's cheeks flushed. His gavel hand twitched again, but still he didn't strike it. To do so would feel hollow, impotent. He looked down at his papers, at the rigid lines of case law that suddenly seemed flimsy against the living testimony. Standing in his courtroom, Daniel sat quietly, watching it all unfold. For years he had felt like the powerless one, the one crushed beneath bureaucracy and indifference. But now, he realized something almost foreign. The judge was cornered. The power had shifted. Morton could cling to procedure, but no one was listening. Not anymore. Halstead's voice broke the silence once more, steady and final. So I ask you, Judge Morton, will you stand on the side of paper, or will you stand on the side of honor? The question hung in the air, heavy as a verdict. Morton's lips parted, but before he could speak, the room seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to choose, not just for Daniel, but for every man and woman who had ever walked into a sterile office and been told their scars didn't count. For the first time in his career, Judge Morton didn't look like the arbiter of truth. He looked like the one being judged. The words still echoed, will you stand on the side of paper, or will you stand on the side of honor? When Claire realized she was crying, not the quiet, restrained tears she had practiced for years, hiding them behind closed doors so her brother wouldn't feel worse than he already did, but open tears that blurred her vision and slid hot down her cheeks. She didn't brush them away. She let them fall. For too long she had been the only witness to Daniel's suffering. She had watched him jolt awake at 3 a.m, choking for breath. She had sat across from him at the kitchen table when he couldn't find words for what weighed on his chest. She had written in her notebook, the one now closed on her lap, every detail, every appointment, every symptom, as if cataloging his pain might somehow prove to the world that it was real. And yet, time after time, the letters came. Claim denied. Insufficient evidence. Symptoms do not meet criteria. Each denial crushed him, and each time Claire had picked him back up, she reminded him that his worth wasn't measured in check. But secretly, she had feared he would never be seen. Now, as she looked at her brother through tears, she saw something shift. His shoulders were still hunched, but no longer in shame, they trembled with something else. The general's presence had lifted him, and for the first time in years, Daniel seemed less like a man drowning and more like a man surfacing for air. The gallery watched her too. Some looked at her with pity, others with respect, but Claire didn't care. Her tears were not weakness. They were testimony. They were the years of silence breaking open. She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the cracks in it. He didn't ask for this, she said, addressing the room, though her eyes stayed on her brother. He never asked to carry nightmares home with him. He never asked for his life to shrink into sleepless nights and closed doors. All he asked, her voice wavered. All he asked was to be acknowledged, to be told that what he sacrificed mattered. Daniel turned his head slightly, eyes shining. Claire, he whispered, but his voice broke. She tightened her grip on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Danny. General Halstead inclined his head toward her, a gesture of recognition. In his gaze, she saw not pity, but understanding, the kind that comes from years of watching families carry invisible burdens long after the parades were over. Judge Morton shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. The sight of a weeping sister, her voice trembling with truth, carried a moral weight no gavel could silence. He looked down at his papers, but the words blurred. What document could compete with the raw honesty standing before him? The gallery absorbed every moment. A veteran in the second row wiped his eyes discreetly. A mother clutched her child's hand tighter. Even the reporters, once eager for sensational quotes, now wrote more slowly, capturing not scandal but humanity. Claire's tears kept coming, but she stood taller for them. Her voice grew steadier. You laughed at him, Your Honor, but I've seen him on nights when laughter would have saved him. Nights when I prayed he would make it till morning. And still he got up. Still he carried on. That isn't weakness. That is strength. Her words were a blade, cutting through years of dismissal, slicing into the callousness that had hardened the system against men like her brother. Daniel lowered his head, his own tears finally breaking free, but he didn't hide them. Not anymore. He let the room see. He let Claire's tears join his, a shared burden, a shared truth. In that moment, the siblings were no longer alone in their fight. The gallery bore witness. The general stood guard, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent, like a congregation holding its breath during prayer. Claire pressed her hand more firmly on Daniel's shoulder, grounding him, anchoring him. They see you now, she whispered through her tears. They can't pretend not to anymore. And as the room sat in quiet awe, the truth was undeniable. Her tears had done what paper never could. They had made the invisible visible. They had made her brother human again, in the eyes of everyone watching. For most of the hearing, the gallery had been an audience detached, whispering, waiting for drama rather than justice. They had leaned back on the benches with crossed arms, some with skepticism, others with quiet disinterest. But now, after Halstead's account and Claire's trembling defiance, something subtle but irreversible had happened. The room had shifted. It began with the veterans in the front row. The man in the Vietnam cap stood slowly, his legs stiff, as if pulled upward by something greater than his own will. He pressed the cap to his chest, eyes wet but unwavering, and gave Daniel a small nod. The Desert Storm vet beside him followed, straightening as though decades of wear fell away in a single motion. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence was solidarity. The rest of the gallery caught the current. One by one, people leaned forward, their faces no longer skeptical, but softened. Some with shame for having doubted, others with awe. The murmurs changed. They were no longer whispers of dismissal tax dollars, exaggerations, malingering, but quiet words of respect. He saved him. He really saved him. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to catch the story as it transformed before their eyes. What had started as a routine benefits appeal was now history. A four-star general, standing in open defense of a mimetic, a sister's tears carving through stone-hearted procedure, a courtroom reeling under the weight of truth. Cameras clicked, but for once, the images captured dignity rather than scandal. Daniel felt it too. He had walked into the courtroom believing the odds were stacked, believing the best he could hope for was survival of humiliation. But now the air carried a different charge. It was thick, yes, but not with dismissal, with recognition. For the first time, the eyes on him didn't feel like judgment. They felt like witness. Claire's hand never left his shoulder. She felt the shift ripple through the room and breathed deeply, finally letting her chest rise without the constant fear of collapse. She looked at her brother and whispered, "Do you feel it? They see you now." Daniel nodded slowly, unable to speak. His throat was too tight, but his eyes said enough. For years, he had felt invisible. For years his pain had been a private storm. But now, with every nod, every straightened spine in the gallery, he realized the storm was no longer his alone. Judge Morton felt it too, though he tried to deny it. He leaned back, tugging at the collar of his robe, eyes darting nervously from Halstead to the veterans standing to the quiet, reverent faces in the gallery. His authority had been absolute when he chuckled at Daniel's trembling hands. Now, it clung to him like a robe too heavy to bear. His gavel lay untouched. Even he seemed to know that one sharp crack against the wood would not restore the control he had lost. The state attorney, who had earlier recited statistics with detached certainty, now sat rigid, his papers forgotten. His pen lay idle, his eyes lowered, as if even he could no longer stomach the defense he had been sent to argue. General Halstead remained steady at the center, his presence anchoring the room. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His account, his salute, his acknowledgement had spoken louder than any order he had ever given in combat. And then came the quiet ripple, the final turn. A woman in the gallery, a military spouse whose husband's picture hung at the local VFW hall, stood and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, almost lost, but others heard. Another echoed it, then another, until the room, still hushed, carried a wave of gratitude, murmured like a prayer. "Thank you, thank you." Daniel lowered his head, overwhelmed. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't hide them. Not this time. Because in this moment, the courtroom was no longer a place where he had to justify his pain. It was a place where his sacrifice was seen. The tide had turned. The lonely fight was no longer his alone. The room, once cold, dismissive, even mocking, now stood as witness, as ally, as proof. Whatever verdict was to come, one truth had already been written into the walls. Daniel Reyes was not invisible anymore. Judge Morton's hand hovered near his gavel, but he didn't strike it. The polished wood, once his instrument of control, now seemed powerless in his grip. His eyes darted between the gallery, faces lifted, reverent, unflinching, and a general, standing tall at the center of the room. He looked at Claire's tear-streaked face, then finally at Daniel, who sat with trembling hands, but a spine that seemed straighter than when the morning began. Morton cleared his throat, the sound too thin in the heavy silence. "This court," he began, but his voice faltered. He shuffled the papers on his desk, buying himself seconds, searching for footing that no longer existed. This court must weigh facts, not sentiment. His eyes flicked toward Halstead, then quickly away. But facts have been presented through testimony, through witness, through service that cannot be denied. The gallery leaned forward. Even the reporters stopped their scribbling. Everyone knew they were about to hear not just a ruling, but a reckoning. Morton shifted again, tugging at his robe, as though it were suffocating him. Sergeant Reyes' claim has been reviewed, challenged, and he paused, swallowing the word he wanted to say, denied. Instead, his voice grew quieter, begrudging but firm. But it is clear to this court that the scars borne by this veteran are not temporary, nor are they trivial. They are enduring. They are disabling. And they are owed recognition. The words rang like a bell. Claire gasped, her hand gripping Daniel's shoulder tighter. Daniel sat frozen, struggling to absorb what he had just heard. Morton's gaze dropped to his notes. Therefore, it is the decision of this court that Sergeant Daniel Reyes is to be granted full disability benefits, retroactive to his original claim. This ruling recognizes the legitimacy of his condition and his right to support from the nation. He served. For a moment, silence held again. Then it broke not with laughter, not with doubt, but with the soft rumble of applause. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it grew, swelling from the veterans in the front row, from the military spouse near the back, from strangers who had walked into the courtroom indifferent but now found themselves moved to honor. Morton banged his gavel, flustered. Order. This is still a court of law. But even his voice couldn't smother the sound. It wasn't rowdy. It wasn't defiant. It was respect. Daniel turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the room, tears blurring the faces into halos of light. He saw the veterans nodding, saw Claire's proud, tearful smile, saw General Halstead's steady gaze, unwavering. He inhaled deeply, the breath shaking but strong. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like his lungs were carrying fire. It felt like air. He lowered his head briefly, whispering words meant only for his sister. We did it. Claire bent close, her forehead against his temple. No, Danny, you did. The state attorney gathered his papers stiffly, his jaw tight. But even he couldn't meet Daniel's eyes. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to deny. Halstead stepped closer, placing one gloved hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of a salute, of a thank you, of a nation reminded of its promises. Your fight isn't over, the general said quietly, just for Daniel. But you'll never fight it alone again. Daniel's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak. But his silence was not weakness. Now it was acceptance. It was dignity. It was peace. However fragile, as the gavel struck one final time, closing the case, the sound no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like closure. And in that small county courtroom, under buzzing lights and peeling paint, something larger than law had unfolded. Justice had not come from statutes or checkboxes, but from truth laid bare, from solidarity, from honor defended, not once on a battlefield, but again in a place where it was nearly lost. The verdict had been rendered, but the real victory was already won. The courtroom slowly emptied, but no one left in haste. The gallery moved with a hushed reverence, as though they had witnessed something sacred and were reluctant to break its spell. Reporters packed away, their notepads more gently than usual, their faces softened by the weight of the story they had just recorded. Veterans lingered near the back, exchanging quiet nods, some wiping eyes, others simply standing tall, as though the years had lifted from their shoulders. Daniel remained seated at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting flat, trembling but calm. The weight of years of denial and humiliation was still on him, but it no longer crushed him. It was lighter now, shared by every soul who had been present. Claire stayed at his side, her hand gripping his firmly, unwilling to let go even. For a moment, General Halstead did not leave right away either. He stood by Daniel, his presence as immovable as it had been since the moment he entered. He looked down at the young veteran and spoke quietly, his voice carrying a note of solemnity. You saved me once. Today, I only return the favor. Daniel's throat tightened. He shook his head. You didn't have to do this. Halstead's expression softened, though his jaw remained firm. Yes, I did, because too many can't be here to speak for themselves. Too many are buried with their truths ignored. We owe them every fight we can still win. The words struck deep. Daniel felt them resonate in the hollow places inside him, the places carved out by friends lost, names etched into stone walls. Faces that returned in dreams but never in daylight. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he saw them Martinez, who had joked even in fight. Collins, who never made it past 19. Walker, who always promised to write home but never got the chance. When he opened his eyes again, Halstead's steady gaze met his own. The general gave a small nod, and then, slowly, deliberately, he brought his hand to his brow and saluted. The room, though half-emptied, froze again. The veterans who remained straightened instinctively. Claire gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. A salute in that setting, in a courtroom, to a man who sat trembling, not in uniform, not on a battlefield, was not ordinary. It was extraordinary. Daniel's breath caught. His hands trembled harder. And then, with a slow, unsteady motion, he pushed himself to his feet. His knees wobbled, but he stood. His right hand lifted, shaking, and he returned the salute. Not perfect, not crisp, but true. It was more than a gesture. It was an acknowledgement, from one soldier to another, from one survivor to another, from the living to the fallen. The veterans in the gallery followed. One by one, they rose and saluted. To Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq, each carried different scars, but in that moment they were united, their silent salute rising like a tide. Claire wept openly now, but she didn't hide it. She knew she was watching something she would never forget. Something bigger than verdicts, bigger than courts, bigger even than the war that had stolen so much. Daniel lowered his hands slowly, his chest rising with a deep, steady breath. For the first time in years, the trembling inside him was not from fear or shame. It was from release. Halstead dropped his hand as well, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "You carried me out of fire," he said, his voice firm but heavy with memory. "Today, we carried you." Daniel nodded once, his jaw clenched, tears streaking his face. "For them," he whispered. "For them," Halstead echoed. The words seemed to linger in the stale air, sanctifying the courtroom into something more than brick and wood. It had become a memorial, not just for Daniel's fight, but for every soldier whose struggle had been dismissed, every sacrifice overlooked. When they finally stepped out into the light of day, Daniel felt the warmth of the sun on his face. It wasn't the same sun that had blazed down on Fallujah, or the cold glow of fluorescent courtroom lights. It was different, brighter, warmer. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time, he believed he could breathe it in fully. The verdict had given him recognition, but the salute, that was his true victory. A salute to the fallen, and to the living, who still carried them. A promise that none of it had been in vain. And as Daniel walked out with Claire by his side, and the general close behind, he carried not just his own scars, but the memory of every brother he had lost. But now, finally, he carried them with honor.